This is DibTech Talk, a show where we make sense of all things cybersecurity for the defense industrial base. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of DibTech Talk. So this is going to be kind of a long intro to tee up my interview. So I want to talk about some of the comments on the interim rule. I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of weeks reading through some of the comments on the DFARS interim rule, and I want to highlight one of the comments that I think is most concerning, and it involves operational technology systems. So Mr. Metzger, who is a lawyer in the government contracting space here in the DC area, his comment talks about defining the differences between IT and OT. So OT are those operational technology systems that the manufacturing base that comprise probably the majority of the supply chain. Those are the machines that are used to produce widgets. IT systems, on the other hand, are those information technology systems which are used solely for the purpose of information, creating, transmitting, storing information. And for those IT systems, NIST 800-171 was created so that we can protect the CUI that resides in those IT systems. Mr. Metzger points out that OT systems are probably not well suited for those NIST 800-171 controls. He argues that there are industry best practices which should be applied to those OT systems, but NIST 800-171 controls are not them. He further goes on to explain that in the current DoD assessment methodology, companies with OT systems that cannot implement the 171 controls, they're allowed to claim what's called an enduring exception. An enduring exception acknowledges that you can't implement the 171 control, but you get to score yourself as if you have implemented those controls. So this creates a problem with the scoring because the score doesn't really tell the true security posture of your OT system because you can't implement it, and therefore you score yourself as if you have. So the score is artificially high, and then you're not required to implement any compensating control to make up for the fact that you don't have a NIST 800-171 control. So there's that issue. The second issue that Mr. Metzger brings up in his comment is, what about the CMMC? So Mr. Metzger's comment was submitted before the deadline of 30 November. And since then, the CMMC assessment guide has been released. So we have a little bit more information to go from than when Mr. Metzger did when he posted his comment. So his question in his comment is, what happens to these OT systems when the CMMC rolls out? Does an enduring exception apply to the CMMC? Well, the CMMC assessment guide says that each control will be assessed as either having been met, or not applicable. So my question is, does the not applicable apply to those enduring exceptions? We don't know. But what we do know is industry is already being impacted. We are seeing customers who have been told by DoD for previously awarded contracts that if they don't submit a self-assessment score, then the funds are going to be withheld. And that contract doesn't have the 7019 clause in it. And I've also talked to somebody this week who has seen the CMMC DFARS clause in a contract, and there are no CMMC assessors. So no one really knows what's going on, who to trust, what to do. So this brings me to my guest for today, Allison Giddens. She's my first repeat offender on DibTech Talk, and she is the DoD poster child for what DoD says the supply chain should have been doing. Allison has dedicated hours of her own personal time to figure out the NIST 800-171 requirements. She's implemented them for her company, and she's been doing this for the last few years, for at least the last 3 years since it became a requirement. But Allison is facing some of the same questions and challenges that companies who have been derelict in their duty of implementing NIST 800-171. So please join me as I chat with Allison about her struggles, some of her tricks that she's been using to figure out how to score herself, and overall, her conversation is really interesting, and I think it applies to a vast majority of the supply chain. So sit tight and enjoy our conversation. Allison, thank you so much for joining me on DibTech Talk again. You're my first repeat interview. So for everyone who hasn't seen our previous interview, can you talk a little bit about yourself and your background and why you're so relevant to this topic today?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me back. Loved the first conversation, so glad to keep it going. My name is Allison Giddens, and I am co-president of WinTech, an aerospace machine shop located outside of Atlanta, Georgia. We are a small business, and just like many small businesses in the DIB, we are neck deep in the CMMC world, DFARS clauses and NIST and everything in between. So I serve as the IT, or kind of I guess the CISO is, which is kind of funny in a small business, but kind of the person who's running the show behind the scenes and making some decisions. But just here to, like I said, keep the conversation going, and always learning from my peers on this, people that are a heck of a lot smarter than I am.
Yeah. So just to clarify, you are a manufacturer. Your company is a manufacturing company in the DIB. Can you talk about a little bit about the type of manufacturing so people get a better idea of
Sure.
what kind of network you might have?
We do a lot of work, probably about 60 or 70% of work for defense primes, a lot of ground support equipment, and we've been in business for 33 years. So 25 of those years we've been working for defense. So we've got a lot of experience in a lot of different things that go in the air, and it's only getting more complicated, but we feel we're really good at what we do on the shop floor. And with all the new technology requirements, especially the cybersecurity requirements coming out, there's a lot to keep up with, the stuff that we're not typically, we don't have the expertise on. So we're working twice as hard to keep on par.
Yeah. And that's, I think one of the most interesting things I learned about our first interview is how much time you personally have dedicated to this. Can you talk briefly about how much sweat equity you put into this effort, whether you're getting paid for this or not? How long have you been working towards NIST 800-171 and implementing it for your company?
Well, it's been several years since it flowed down initially. And so we had poems and consultants and gap analysis and all that kind of fun stuff for the past probably 5 years. But it's really just been in the last 18 months, maybe 2 years, that it's really ramped up. I kind of joke with my husband that I come home so that I can get things done for work. So when I'm actually on site, I'm doing all the IT background and stuff, and then I'll come in on weekends and actually run the business. But
I would consider you an early adopter of NIST 800-171, right? Like, even though it's been a requirement, I feel like only now companies are really starting to say, oh, we've had to do this whole time. So you've been doing this almost from the beginning, it seems like, right?
Yeah, we've been, a lot of that has been familiar to us, and thankfully we've surrounded ourselves with the right people. So we've had people on staff, and we've had our MSP and different people that we trusted alert us to this a long time ago, and be able to recognize it and flow down and say, this is a thing, right? And
so how helpful has your MSP been? Because I've heard different things from different companies that some MSSPs are really good and understand the compliance, and some. How has your experience been with your MSSP?
So we've had a really good luck with our MSP, but it's really been the people on the peripheral that have been the rock stars. So we are a member of a local manufacturing association that ended up connecting us to someone who just really gets it. And he by himself was able to connect us to different people and different things that ultimately expanded our network and introduced us to new people and new things. And it's kind of one of those, and then they tell two friends and they tell two friends. And so that has really helped. I think that keeping the conversation going has been key. It's not stopping.
Yeah. So this local resource that you have, is this a state-based or a geographic, in like even smaller than the state?
So it was actually the Georgia Manufacturing Alliance, and then they, along with the Cobb Chamber of Commerce, it just so happened that this one individual was a part of both of those groups, and so was I at the time. And so just being able to connect with him, and he was already familiar with the manufacturing side, and he was already on the business side. He had worked with Wozniak out west for many years, so he got it. And then initially when I brought him on the shop floor, showed him kind of the challenges that we were up against, and I remember him asking me certain questions about our security that I was like, what does that have to do with anything? And now looking back on it, it's plain as day in CMMC. It's like, wow, that was prophetic. So
are you aware, and this is just to try to help all of the other manufacturers out there that don't have this state-based or are not aware of their state-based. So in addition to the state and local resources, are you aware of any national alliances or programs that are similar to help companies that may not have as good a base as Georgia?
So I know a lot of states have some MEPs that typically people are referred to for grants and things like that. And I kind of, a lot of times I cringe when somebody's like, well, who's going to give us the money to upgrade systems and stuff? And someone's like, oh, just talk to your MEP. It's like, that's really not how it works. And it's not as easy as it sounds either. The MEPs in a lot of states are fantastic, and they will have some good resources and different people to connect. But I would also recommend to people, check out this. I know this sounds kind of dumb, but check out social media. I mean, you've got your LinkedIn groups, and you've got even on Discord, you've got these different groups that you can sit and lurk and hang out and watch and read and learn so much, and you will eventually figure out exactly who the right people are to go to. So worst case, if you don't have a really good legit or real-time connection with your MEPs, your Chamber of Commerce's, or your manufacturing alliances, things like that. Don't discount social media by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, that's totally true. I'm in this like group chat on LinkedIn, and almost every day our group chat talks about something related to this and like the challenges and what's going on and how did you guys solve this. So yeah, I think you're right. Not like continuing the conversation, that whole theme of conversations with each other with similar companies, similar industries, and helping each other to solve these problems when there may not be good resources. So not the whole, but one of the main reasons I wanted to talk to you again in relation to the interim rule. So now that the interim rule has gone into effect, it went into effect 30 November. So starting 1 December, in theory, contracts can start being impacted by these new DFARS clauses. So I really wanted to dig into some of the comments because I know that I submitted comments and I wanted to read other people's comments. Turns out lots of people and organizations wrote dissertations on the interim rule, and I only had time to read a few. But one of the ones that I read that really stuck out to me in relation to you is Robert Metzger's comments about the difference between OT, operational technology, and IT, which is information technology, and how NIST is largely built or is built and designed for information systems, not operational technology systems. So Robert Metzger, in his comment, does a great job of defining OT, but I think it lacks the visual description of what OT actually is. Can you talk about what OT is in relation to manufacturing?
Sure. So for a manufacturing environment, as I read the OT and the IT kind of struggle, I am reminded of a tour that I took at a manufacturing facility in Savannah. This was a couple of years ago. And they talked about how they had a lot of older machines on the shop floor, and those older machines had screens on them for obvious reasons where you could program at the machine. They also had USB flash drives where you could use a USB and transfer data, from a workstation over back to the machine itself. And I remember thinking how primitive it was, but at the same time, I remember thinking, well, that's effective. I mean, you could have somebody programming over here, you pop it out over, you can maximize your efficiency as to when that machine is actually running. And looking at Mr. Metzger's comments and looking at just a lot of different conversations happening with OT and IT, there's really no good fix for that. Because yes, you can turn off ports and you can you can label USB flash drives all day long on the shop floor. But if somebody does pick up a USB flash drive in the parking lot and bring it in and plug it into a machine because they're kind of curious to see what it does, without being an IT genius, I know that that's probably not a good move. So there are so many different pieces of the puzzle, I think, on the shop floor that NIST misses, and not on purpose, but just because by nature it really is IT focused.
So how are you dealing with because you've submitted a score into SPRS,
Yes.
So you had to go through the scoring using 171 alpha, and you've gotten to these controls that cannot be implemented in your system. So how have you thought about those, and how have you addressed them in just for your NIST scoring?
So as we went through our self-assessment, our scoring, we pretended like an assessor was sitting across from us, and we needed to justify our answers. And when it really was not, when the item was not applicable to us, we really did put the not applicable or the enduring exception option. We are kind of interpreting them the same way. I mean, until somebody tells us otherwise, we're not doing it to be obtuse. We're doing it because we're saying this honestly is not a risk to us because it's not a thing. we scored ourselves. We had a professional look at it to make sure that we were not, you know, the fox watching the hen house, so to speak. But yeah, that's going to be a beast because of the all or nothing aspect.
Yeah. So are you being overly cautious with the NIST because you're anticipating the CMMC assessor in the future with this all or nothing?
And obviously, and I don't think this is super secret to tell anybody, but we did not score 100%. We did not score 110. I think if anybody tells you that they did, they're probably lying. Um, I, the first assessment that we have, the first official one that we have in the future, I do anticipate gnashing of teeth. I do anticipate some pushback, and I think that if you didn't get pushback, I think that your assessor's no good. But at the same time, there has to be some sort of reasonable expectation on that assessor's part and some basic understanding of how a manufacturing environment works. And that's going to be incredibly challenging. I jumped on a couple of webinars last week and I asked the question, what kind of background do these assessors have generally? And I know that the answer was security. It's like, okay, yeah, I know that. But generally, when you have an AS9100 or an ISO person come in to audit for a certification, a lot of times their background's quality or manufacturing. So to have a CMMC assessor come in and for their background to be security, that's a no-brainer. But in what context? So I think that's going to be really key and comes back to that OT IT discussion.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting comment about having specialized C3PAOs in manufacturing, because if these people who have a background in security in information systems may have never even been on a shop floor to see what OT systems look like. So in the CMMC and DoD assessment methodology, it talks about, and I think even Metzger talks about it in his comments, about how the OT systems are sometimes totally separate from your IT systems. Are yours two separate systems, and is your system security plan covering both of them, or did you have to come up with a separate SSP for your OT systems?
We just came up with a single SSP. And I think a colleague of mine said it really well. So when it comes to your SSP, that should be the beautiful thing that knocks anybody's socks off. And it should be clear, and it should be telling, and it should really give an awesome view of your environment and your infrastructure and your network. So rather than get too crazy about having two, and we recognize you have to have basically a single SSP per cage code for SPRS. So
but you can repeat this, like, right? You can apply it to multiple cage codes. You just have to report per cage code,
right. So we just kind of did it for simplistic sake, but we also said, okay, what actually works? Because we're not going to have two or three different versions of this if it means we got to keep up with two or three different versions.
Absolutely. And the guidance absolutely allows for that. So why would you not keep it simple? So I don't like to be in the business of being a conspiracy theorist or a rock thrower, because I really think cybersecurity culture change is desperately needed within the department and the supply chain. But do you see this self-assessment situation and further down the line, the CMMC, causing potential bottlenecks or issues in the supply chain? And if you do, how can we start talking about that now? Because to your point, continuing the conversation, we need to have these conversations now to war game out what could happen. So do you see potential issues? Where are the issues? Do you see them being on the DoD contracting side, that they're not able to purchase the goods and services they want? Or do you see, how do you see this playing out?
So I've got something that has recently popped up for us in the past week, was that we were notified one of our primes is canceling a contract and moving it to another prime. And then that prime is going to be ordering the same item from us. And it was kind of an interesting correspondence, because first off, in the 14 years I've been here, I've never had that happen. And secondly, it wasn't as if they were asking, they were telling us. And we're a little guy. The part that we're supplying, it's not humongous. It's not like we don't have a ton of leverage. Let's just say that. And it's not a bridge to burn at all. So right. I just needed to know what kind of questions to ask. So of course, the very first question I had was, okay, the original purchase order was placed in July, and we've begun work and we're in the midst of it. And they're going to cancel it effective December 31st and reissue it January 1st with this other prime. They want us to continue work, no stop work. So if that new order is placed, is it going to have the 7019, 7020? You see where I'm going with this? So if it has that, well, now the rules have all changed. Now the flow down has changed. And now the 6061, I don't even know what material this is right. For all I know, the aluminum that we purchased from whatever mill was appropriate at the time for that prime and for that flow down, but may not. If we didn't flow down the info, then technically, assuming we had to flow CUI to that supplier, now the rules have changed. So there will be some interesting overlap. I know that we're not the only one that gets some sort of transfer, but there will be some interesting things to happen.
And speaking of funny business with primes, have you been told by any of your primes that you're required to submit a score by a certain date?
We had one prime email us and ask if we had planned to before we actually did. But ever since then, we have not heard a peep, which I guess is a good thing.
Yeah. So how are you guys planning to manage your own supply chain? To your point about now, if this clause appears 1 January, how are you guys working? Are you inventing a new system? Are you purchasing some, service to help you manage that? How does that work?
So currently for AS9100, we already have to do an assessment of risk of our approved suppliers. And the majority of our suppliers, yes, they're approved by WinTech, but they're ultimately approved by our customer, and that's why they end up on our list. So there's kind of a 2-level of approval status, so to speak. Going forward, what's going to have to happen is we've got the boilerplates all ready to go, but we have not yet seen the flow down. But as soon as we do, we will be able to reach out to those suppliers and say, we have to have your word that a score is submitted to SPRS, because that's a challenge for small businesses. And I know for primes too, that even primes don't have necessarily access to see if other companies have submitted the score. You have to go on your word.
Yeah. So are you taking people at their word? Are you asking for screenshots? Like what proof?
The game plan is to ask for something in writing. And one of those things will be a screenshot. And if somebody wants to blur out their score, that is completely appropriate.
So you're not asking for score at all. You're just asking for binary yes, no.
Because
have you done
that? That is what everybody has asked of us, basically, is 7019 says a score uploaded. So technically, we're not going to ask for anything more, because when somebody asks us, we're not going to give anything else.
Yeah. So, to that point, so DoD hasn't issued any guidance about what's an ideal scores. They've said that perfect score obviously is 110, but what does a negative 97 look like? Or how is that going to be considered if a contracting officer is looking at multiple scores of all of their options? So did you guys take into, because I think, Leslie thinking here that if I have scored myself or a third party has scored my company and gives me a negative 100, realizing that the most negative score you can get is like negative 207. So I have, I'm not like the worst of the worst, but it's a pretty bad score, it seems like. So maybe I just give myself a few like vanity points. Like, what if I just threw an extra 20 points in there?
Right. A negative 80 sounds a lot better than a negative 107. A heck of a lot better.
Yeah. Right. So is that something that you guys worried about posting and, not asking about your score, but did it make you stop and think like, what does this score project about my company?
I think, going back to the talk about whether or not I'm a conspiracy theorist, I think that ultimately what these scores are going to offer the DoD is baseline. And I think that they're going to be able to say, okay, X percentage of the scores that are in our system fall within this range, and X percent are in this range. And not necessarily what specifics does that tell us, but what does that tell us from a grand statement of cybersecurity posture. And now that we have these initial scores, now after a year, let's run it again and see what updates people have entered their scores in. And see.
So I would agree with you once we're 5 years into this, but these initial scores that companies are being forced to submit before they're ready, Yes, it'll serve as a baseline. Like absolutely this year will serve, 2021 will be the baseline score setting. But I theorize that these scores are wrong. They're either people have assessed themselves as too high because people tend to, when they self-reflect, give it's the halo effect, like, oh yeah, I'm totally doing this because they haven't done it with NIST 171. So totally going to put you on the spot. If a CMMC auditor came in or the DIBCAC assessors came in next week and verified your SSP, how confident are you that they would give you the same score that you gave yourself?
The same score I gave myself or the same score I uploaded, because I scored myself and I got one score, and then I worked with a third-party professional, and he said to me, when I go through this, just know I'm going to be very hard on you. And I said, have at it. And he came back and he said, you were close, but not so much. And he gave us
Were
a
you
little
over
bit of
or
a
under?
low. I was a tiny bit over. And so he gave us,
Okay.
so yes, if an assessor came in today and butted the score that I uploaded, so the worst one,
Right.
if he said, okay, am I going to get to this? I'd say, heck yeah, you are. So I'm confident on
Okay.
that.
Okay. So before you had this third party come in though, like, and knowing that you've dedicated so much of your time to prepare for this, before you had that third party, if somebody were to say, place a bet on your accuracy or what you're over under, how confident would you have been in that score, just you having done it on your own?
Honestly, I think I would have been a 50-50, because
Yeah.
it really was a matter of, okay, well, I did this based on my own knowledge and kind of being in the weeds, and not being a security professional, so to speak, a trained actual knowing what I'm doing from that perspective 24 hours a day, but also from, again, the context of, here you have an assessor coming in, and my undergraduate degree is in psychology. I love the psychology behind all this. And if I'm an assessor in this brand new certification model, and I come in and I already know that the manufacturer, the person in the DIB, is already going to be on the defense, because they probably don't want you there. I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. They don't want you there. You're going to eat up their time. You're going to eat up their resources, and you're going to tell them what you're doing is wrong. And now, as an assessor, you not only kind of have to wave the white flag if that's the way you're going to go and play nice, or you're going to put your foot down right from the get-go and make sure they know who's boss. So if you're not confident in your own score, and if you're not certain on every item on your SSP that you can justify 6 ways to Sunday, that's going to be fascinating, because I already know. I mean, the AS 9100 and ISO audits, those are already, even when you can do it in your sleep, they can be a beast. So this is going to be fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. So the interim rule, it's, I think, massively underestimates the time and cost impact of the 7019 clause. DoD says that this is a 30-minute scoring exercise, $50. Okay. So let's just pretend that you haven't been dedicating hours of your life for years to be NIST 171 compliant. Let's just pretend that that's the cost that DoD is saying that you've had to eat. We're not acknowledging that. Okay. We'll wipe that slate. So the time, how much time, can you tell us about how much time you worked with this third party who verified your SSP, and give us a rough estimate of cost for how much extra you had to pay to double check your work?
Oh gosh. Kind of depends on where that's starting. I mean, I know that magic $3,000 has been thrown out, which is hysterical. I hear a laugh track when I read those. At least between my time and paying the person and the time, really, you could add the cost or add the lost money of things that I'm not doing.
Opportunity cost.
Easy 20,000. Easy.
Oh, that's a pretty low.
But that's just in that tiny little window. That's not.
And how many hours, like how many person hours between you meeting with that person for hours at a time and their work, that they could do reviewing your documentation? How many hours do you think that person worked, and including your hours?
That person might have worked maybe 30 hours specifically on this little project. This is all just this window. This is, when I say the 20,000, I'm thinking from September to now, really. I mean, that it wasn't a.
And for reference, September was 3 months ago?
Yes. Yep. 3 months ago. You got it. Yep. September 2020. Yep. Easy.
Wow.
Yep.
That's That's a heavy lift. And that's exactly, I mean, that's in line with literally every other defense contractor that I've talked to. And I've probably talked to 15 or 20 in that time too. So, okay. Thanks for
Yeah.
validating, being one more use, like, absolutely. This
And
is
it's
the
tough because
situation.
it's
So
not as though you're asking us to stroke a check for $20,000 where I can sit here and fight it. I mean, you could almost argue, people that are flat tax, when they push that, they talk about how, well, if people had to stroke a check to the government every month instead of it coming out of a paycheck, it would hurt a lot more. And that's kind of the same thing here. I think the same argument where it would be, I think it would hurt a lot more if somebody said, okay, in order to be CMMC certified, we'll take it from here, but you got to stroke a check for 230 grand a year or whatever number that I think a lot of
yeah.
people would say. Yeah, no, that's no. Although maybe
Well,
not.
I mean, so yeah, so your company is very lucky to have you because you care, you've been paying attention, but most of the companies don't have an Allison. They have a dedicated ops team that only keeps their head down and only focuses on ops. And now they're getting these memos from their suppliers or their primes saying you have to do this, and they're like, what? So what if there were some sort of like socialized healthcare, but socialized cybersecurity care where you could crowdsource, cybersecurity, because endpoint solutions and some of these solutions don't scale very well. They're affordable for 7 endpoints, but if you have 200 endpoints, the enterprise license is still too expensive, but you have 200 endpoints at $7 an endpoint just for your endpoint security. So maybe that's a solution that comes up in the future once enough people feel this pain point. But with that in mind, do you think that there is some way now that DoD or the federal government, because even the federal government is going to the NIST 800-171 requirement for federal contractors. So DoD's felt it for years. The rest of the federal contractors will begin to feel it. They're not going to have the CMMC just quite yet. But how can DoD or the federal government kind of alleviate some of these pain points that you're already feeling?
The DoD can work on clarity. If the DoD can help us out by singing from the same sheet of music, um, putting clear communication out to DIB. There's too much misinformation out there. And I don't think it's anybody's necessarily fault. I think everybody's eager to push this and make sure everybody understands the seriousness of it. And we're over that. We get it. It's serious. We've been hearing that song for a while now. And those that are on board, and we need to be told what it is to do next. Manufacturers are awesome at following directions, but if we don't have directions, we sit here and we ask, well, if you're not going to tell us what to do, we're just going to do with whatever we can with whatever we have. And I think if the single thing the DoD can do right now is tell us what the heck's going on, give us some clear communication.
That's such a cheap fix. Here I am thinking about socialized cybersecurity, and you just want information.
I just want something clear. I don't want to be told that things are going to be costing X dollars if the AB is not going to go down, or if the DoD is not going to go down the road of telling us what to expect in dollars, then the DoD needs to go down the road of telling us what to expect, period.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that assessment. So that seems easy enough, right?
Piece of cake.
and not to mention the cost of the CMMC assessment itself, right? Like this is your $20,000 3-month expense to get to a point where you believe you're compliant, but then you're, according to the interim rule, going to have to fork out another almost $30,000 for somebody to double check your double check and hope that the double check is in line with your double check.
Right.
Yeah. So, and then I'm sure why I would imagine, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine you'll want the person who's double checked your SSP to maybe act as your advocate as you go through the CMMC assessment, which adds another layer of cost, because how can you go head to head with an auditor, when that's not your manufacturer, you're not.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so I really want to keep following up with you. I think this would be a really interesting series of interviews, like as things unfold, as the administration changes, as this comes into its own. Maybe we can check back in every 6 months or so and just see how life is in the DIB and the typical manufacturer. And you're in a very interesting state. We don't have to put this in the actual interview, but go vote.
I know, right?
Please go vote. I think this will the Georgia vote will have a lot of impact, I think, on how life unfolds for the next 4 years. So, but yeah, Allison, thank you so much for sharing your insight and knowledge. You're a unique gem inside the defense manufacturing base. So I think you have one of the most unique perspectives because you cared and have done NIST 800-171. And so you are the poster child for DoD when they talk about you should have already been doing this. So, you shouldn't have any problems with what's going on, but that's in fact not the case. And even people as diligent as you are still facing problems that people who have never implemented NIST 800-171 are facing. So thank you so much.
Thanks for chatting.
Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Dib Tech Talk. Today's episode was the last episode for the year of 2020. 2020 has been so bad for so many reasons. We've had COVID, we've had wildfires on the West Coast, we've survived murder hornets, and we've also seen the death of two heroes, Black Panther and RBG. But 2020 wasn't all bad. In fact, the CMMC was published earlier this year. The DoD published their CUI program. My daughter turned 5. And most of all, we have a vaccine. COVID is almost over. We are, in fact, hopefully going to round the corner in 2021. So stay tuned. Big new things happening in 2021 for Dib Tech Talk. And thank you so much for joining me this year as we kicked off Dib Tech Talk. I look forward to many, many more years talking to all of you about all things Dib and cybersecurity.